When your grandfather asked Dad if he wanted to sell, he jumped at the chance, and they went off to Kansas City to make their fortune. I refused to go, and since I was over 18, they couldn't make me. It's hard making my own way, but I don't intend to ever leave this place if I can help it. Your grandfather lets me stay in a little room in the lodge as part of my pay. I get to eat from the lodge tables, so I get by. I just get so angry sometimes at Dad for leaving all this I sort of lose it. Jeff pulled Abby into his arms to comfort her. She nestled her head under his chin and pressed her cheek to his chest. He could feel her tears on his bare chest. Jeff sighed. It felt so good to have a woman in his arms again. He started when the thought that Abby was just the perfect height for cuddling percolated through his tired, slightly drunken brain. He turned his head and placed a gentle kiss on the top of her head. Abby, I know exactly what you mean. I planned to move back here to Steelville when I finished college. I had fallen madly in love with my wife before I graduated, and we were to marry after we both got our degrees. Before the wedding, we were talking about where we would live, and Amy flat out refused to move back here. She told me it was either her or Steelville, and I chose her. I did manage to get her to live in Springville so I could come home frequently. As you have probably heard, she refused to come with me most of the time. For some reason, she hates all small towns and rural areas with a passion. I wish now I had chosen Steelville. I feel myself relaxing every time I turn down the road toward home and this resort. If I ever marry again, I will never marry someone who won't live here with me. It's part of my soul. It's where I belong and where I intend to raise any children I may have. Abby looked up at Jeff and smiled. She used her fingers to wipe the tears from her eyes, then stood on her tiptoes and gave him a fast peck on the lips. Oh, Jeff, I think you love this place as much as I do. If anyone had to buy it, I'm glad it was your grandfather. At least it got the land back in your family, and I can tell your whole family loves it. Jeff looked at Abby and took her hands in his. Yeah, maybe I do. I know I have never been anywhere that makes me feel like I do here. I've never been with anyone who understands how my family and I feel about this place either. I wish I had met someone like you before I met Amy. Abby smiled and said, Thank you, Jeff. That's nice. Now I had better get back to my room. I have some work to do, and it's getting late. I'll be down for breakfast unless you would rather come up to the lodge. No, please come down. I think I like having breakfast here with you better than there. It seems more relaxed here when we eat on the deck. After Abby left, Jeff sat back down on the deck because it was still too early to go to bed and he didn't care to watch TV. Many nights he would read a book or surf the net, but those pastimes held no appeal for him this night. He listened to the happy tinkle of the stream running past the yard and over the rocks while he thought about the difference between Amy and Abigail. Somehow he could never picture Amy here, but more and more he could picture Abby curled up with him as they enjoyed the quiet evenings here alongside the steam. He leaned the chair back and sat watching the stars as he felt the tension drain out of his body and soul. Jeff woke the next morning to peals of laughter and the sun on his face. He felt stiff and had to piss like a racehorse. He was floundering around in confusion before he realized where he was. He had fallen asleep on the deck in his chair and hadn't awakened the entire night. Abby was standing in the door watching him trying to wake and rise from the chair and cackling with laughter. Between her laughs she managed to say, What's the matter, lazy bones? Couldn't you even make it to your own bed last night? I knew I should have taken care of you before I left last night. By the time she had finished her scolding, Abby was standing with an amused look on her face and her fists on her hips. She backed up to let Jeff through the door, and he gave her a disgusted look when he passed her. He had to piss so badly he felt a little dampness in his shorts. He heard Abby laughing again as the sound of a stream carried back to the kitchen area. When Abby heard Jeff walk back into the kitchen, she turned and started to hand him a cup of coffee. Abby stopped in shock when she saw Jeff and rapidly set the cup down. His face had a seriously grim expression, and he was headed straight for her. She felt a flash of fear as he grabbed her, then she exploded in a shriek of laughter when he began tickling her. She fought back, twisting and turning, trying to escape his tickles until he finally stopped. Jeff held her and looked down at her face as he said, Let that be a lesson to you. Don't you know it's not nice to make fun of your elders? Abby stood, trying to be angry at the way he treated her, but she just couldn't keep the angry expression on her face. She was normally a happy person and had a sunny personality that was trying desperately to break through once again. Jeff was looking down at her while she tried to keep from smiling. He looked thoughtful, then his head bent, bringing his face closer and closer to her. Their lips touched. She moaned and plastered her body against him as they strained against each other. When they broke apart, Abby blushed and turned from Jeff. Jeff was standing staring at Abby. He noticed they were both breathing hard. Jeff reached out and gently pulled Abby around her so he could see her face. She put her hands over her face, and he gently grabbed her wrists and pulled them away so he could see her eyes. Neither said anything for several heartbeats. Then Jeff walked toward Abby, pushing her back against the cabinet until she was trapped between his body and the counter. He put his hands on the counter edge, one on each side of Abby, and leaned down to take another kiss, a gentle, loving one this time. Abby returned the kiss. Then when Jeff pulled back, she twisted and picked up the coffee cup once more. Abby handed the cup to Jeff and said, "Here, drink your coffee and behave. Do you want your breakfast now, or should we have some coffee first?" Jeff reached past her to pour another cup of coffee. He handed it to her and took her hand. He led Abby to the deck. They sat watching the sun come up and the warm, relaxing rays stream between the trees surrounding the deck and yard. Neither felt the need to talk. They just sat and listened to the cattle lowing in the background and the stream tinkling past the yard. They enjoyed watching the world wake up for another glorious day. The mist hanging in the field across the stream gave the view a peaceful look. Finally, Abby got up and started toward the kitchen. Before she walked off, she said, "I have to get your breakfast and get to work. Your grandfather will fire me if I keep loafing on the job like I have been since you got here." Jeff followed her into the kitchen and walked up behind her, trapping her between himself and the stove this time. He nuzzled her neck just where it met her shoulder. He smiled when he heard her gasp and saw her tremble. He placed a gentle kiss there, then pulled back and said, "Oh, I would never let him get rid of you, and you know he wouldn't do that anyway. He has told me you could run this place all by yourself already, and he could never replace you if you decide to leave. Besides, what would I do for company if you left me?" Abby felt her stomach warm, and she felt a strange sensation in her as Jeff nuzzled her neck. What was happening to her? She couldn't let this happen. Jeff was a married man, and besides, he couldn't really be interested in her, could he? No. She had to be taking things the wrong way. But why was he kissing her and seeking her out during the day? She smiled and continued cooking their meal, just basking in his presence. She had never felt this way around any other boy or man. It felt good, right even. She was content just to be with him, and it felt wonderful when he held or kissed her. Abby hadn't been gone long when his grandfather walked through the cabin and into Jeff's office. Jeff had been trying to get some work done and was berating himself for letting his personal problems keep him from it. Jeff had not heard his grandfather come into the cabin, so he jumped when he spoke. His grandfather said, "Jeff, if you've got time, I would like to discuss some of the information you gave me on Harriman Printing and some of the things we have uncovered about Howard and his friends." Jeff felt his stomach lurch, and he felt the acid release into his stomach when his grandfather said that. He sighed and said, "I really don't want to think about that mess, but I guess we'd better get it taken care of." Jim sat in one of the large leather chairs tastefully arranged in a corner of the room. He leaned back and put his feet up on the leather footstool before he began to speak. "I finally got word from Homer that he has identified almost all the men Amy has been with since he began his surveillance of her and Howard. There are 2 or 3 he doesn't have full names on, but we know all the companies they work for, and will soon have all the names. Almost all the men she has been with are married, and many of them have children. We have addresses for everyone whose name we know, and much of their personal information besides. Now it's time to begin our moves on them. That is mostly what I want to talk to you about. How hard do you want to be on the men involved with Amy? I know when this happened to me, I opted for the scorched earth policy, but in retrospect, I'm not sure that was the best plan in every case." Jeff sat a moment gathering his thoughts. Jim could see his face redden with his anger, and his breathing deepened and got ragged. Jim could see the struggle as he got control of his emotions before he spoke. "I want to ruin Howard and Amy. I want all the unmarried men to lose their jobs at the very least, and the married ones I want broken, especially the ones we can prove knew that Amy was married. I want all the wives to have everything we gather so they can dump their cheating husbands if they want. As far as I am concerned, they can all be fried. I suggest we turn our information over to the law enforcement agencies and their superiors also. If it can be proven they gave Harriman larger orders or paid more than competitors' prices for the same documents, they may run afoul of laws or corporate policy." Jeff's grandfather grinned at Jeff after he quit speaking. He said, "So far we are in total agreement. I think if we play this right, we can even add a printing unit to our conglomerate. From what you have found and sent me and what Homer has found, I believe we can hurt Howard enough he will have to either sell the business or go into bankruptcy. In either event, I think we can pick it up for pennies on the dollar. With that in mind, I have tentatively outlined a plan of attack. It has a fair chance of success, but it could take several months to complete." Jeff smiled and said, "Time is of no consequence to me. In fact, the longer we drag it out, the more poor old Howard will suffer. If we play it right, we can maximize his suffering and our profits." All I care about is making sure Howard and his cronies know I am the one involved in their pain. I want those a-holes to suffer and to know I am pulling the strings." Jim smiled and said, "I have no problem with that, but you need to be careful. I think I have more experience in these matters and want to help you put the plan into action. We also need to keep Steve in the loop so he can keep us on the right side of the law." The two men visited a while longer than Jim left to go home for lunch. Jeff thought about making a sandwich, then decided to go to the lodge and have one there. It was the end of the lunch period when he walked into the small dining room. Abby looked up from her cleaning in exasperation when she heard the footsteps. Her face broke out into a sunny smile when she saw Jeff, and she felt her heart flutter. Abby didn't remember moving, but the next thing she knew, she was standing beside Jeff's table. Without thinking, she asked, "I didn't expect to see you here. Do you want some lunch, honey?" When she realized what she had said, Abby blushed and bit her lower lip. Jeff smiled and said, "I thought about making a sandwich at the cabin, but I remembered how good a cook you are and decided I would come up here and let you feed me. Maybe we can have lunch together if you have time." Abby got a large smile on her face and said, "Sure. I haven't had my lunch yet. Why don't we go outside to eat, though? It's so nice out there today. I have been dying to find an excuse to go out." While they were eating, Jeff kept looking at Abby. Finally, she put her glass down after taking a drink and said, "What?" Jeff seemed startled and replied, "Huh? What's the matter? Why do you keep looking at me that way? At first you look so calm and happy, then your eyes go blank, and you seem a million miles away. Have I done something? Is something wrong?" "What?" "I'm sorry, Abby. Grandpa and I have begun moving against the men that took my wife away from me. I have been thinking about our next moves and what I have to do to get things rolling. A big part of the work will fall to Grandpa because he is friendly with some of the men we have to get to help us. Even with his help, though, I still have a lot of work to do if we are to succeed. I really hate thinking about how busy I will be doing that because I won't have as much time for our talks and fishing and swimming trips. I am excited about finally getting some revenge, though, also." The next Monday, Amy walked into Howard's outer office and sat at her desk. She was exhausted from her weekend business trip and from fighting the divorce settlement. She had about given up trying to talk to Jeffrey. Every time she got him on the phone, he hung up on her, and many times he would recognize the number and she was sure just not answer. Amy was surprised when she had realized several weeks ago that she really didn't miss Jeffrey. Of course, all her sexual needs were being met and more when she was negotiating deals for Howard. She remembered how she had manipulated Jeff for so long and was sure if she could just get him to talk to her, he would give her more in the divorce settlement. She was thankful he hadn't caused more trouble than he had. Maybe he was the little pissant Howard said he was. Maybe he was afraid to cause too much of a stink because he was afraid to face his betters, like Howard said. When they were dating and engaged, Amy had thought she truly loved Jeffrey. She wondered now if that had been so. She liked him a lot, and they had so much fun in college that she convinced herself she loved him. She hadn't stopped her wild sexual escapades even while they were dating, though. She had grudgingly given them up after she was engaged to him and had missed them terribly until Janet had gotten her promoted to her assistant. Sex with Jeff was great, but there was just something better and more exciting about the wild, uninhibited sex with different, more powerful men that she just had to have. In truth, the danger of getting caught excited her too. At heart, Amy admitted to herself she was a 304. All she really wanted was the money she and Jeff had managed to save while they were married. Well, the money and the sex she was now getting. Amy hadn't even gotten fully settled in her day's routine when Howard buzzed her on the intercom. "Amy, would you come in here, please? I need to talk to you about some things." Amy smiled and told her assistant Sally that she would be in Howard's office and to hold all calls. Sally looked up at Amy and said, "Yeah, I bet he needs to talk. He's probably horny after a weekend without and needs you to relieve some pressure. I swear I don't think his wife ever screws him as randy as he is here in the office. Call me if you need any help." Amy walked toward Howard's door, putting an extra swing in her hips. Just before she opened it, she looked at Sally and said, "Oh, I don't think I'll need any help this time. After all, there's only one man in there." Her eyes were glistening and her breathing had picked up by the time she was behind Howard's closed door. Amy started to unbutton her blouse when she turned to Howard and was shocked when he said, "Don't do that. We have some serious shit to work on this morning. Do you know a Jim Fielding or a Paul or Edward Fielding?" Amy sat down and looked at Howard. His face was white and he looked really unwell. She said, "Yes, I do. Jim Fielding is Jeffrey's grandfather and Paul is his father. Edward is his uncle. Why? I was playing golf this weekend with Stuart Roszkiewicz, and he told me this order we are printing for them now will be the last one we get from them. I asked him why and he said because he was given a choice of either doing business with us or doing business with Jim Fielding and his companies. This morning, just after I got to the office, I got a phone call from Rollins Manufacturing canceling their order and telling me not to call on them again. When I asked David Rollins why he was canceling, he said, I was fishing this weekend with Paul and Edward Fielding and found out some things I didn't like about your business practices. I have seen some DVDs of you and your assistant negotiating with my purchasing department manager, and I don't like your methods. I have fired my purchasing manager and his assistant for giving you the contract. I understand the prosecutor is looking into the legalities of their actions this week. Amy, I have also received 2 faxes canceling orders this morning. I called Joe Randall when I got his and asked him why he was canceling. He said, Howard, I know better than to cross those Fieldings and Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. I don't know what you did to get on their bad side, but if I were you, I would patch things up with them as soon as you can or your business is history. They have a real hard-on for you, and let me know in no uncertain terms that if I kept on doing business with you, I wouldn't do it with them. Hell, they are almost 13% of my receivables, and, truth to tell, they own 43% of my business. Amy, I asked him why he was so worried about a pissant hick and his farm store. He laughed and said, either you're as ignorant as they come or too stupid to know what side of the bread the butter's on. Steelville Feed and Farm is Missouri's Berkshire Hathaway, and Jim Fielding is their Warren Buffett. I'd rather cross my wife and her entire family than mess with them. Amy felt her stomach sink. She had lowered her head when Howard began telling her about the shitstorm that was swirling around their heads. Her stomach became upset, and she began shaking when she raised her head to look at Howard. He was glaring at her with a set jaw and white face. He raised his voice and almost shouted, "You damn little witch. Why didn't you tell me that pissant you were married to pack this much clout? You know, I started to wonder when he beat our first try to get him with the police, and I was really curious when he didn't even seem to notice our 2 other attempts to ruin him after he went back to that hick town. Now I see why. Hell, it was like I was a mosquito biting an elephant. He didn't even feel the prick. Amy, I think you'd better find another job. I can't afford to have you around any longer. I sure as hell hope I can get rid of you fast enough to get this heat off my back. If you'd kept your damn legs together, we wouldn't be in this mess. Now get out." Howard turned his head down and began working on the papers on his desk. Amy stood, and between her tears she said, "Howard, I'm sorry. I just didn't know. They all live like they just barely have enough to get by. They never party or take extravagant trips. It's like they have to watch every penny. They live in that little hick town in those little houses. If they have that kind of money, why don't they show it and use it?" Howard sighed and looked back up at Amy. He asked, "Do you know of Warren Buffett?" Amy nodded her head and he continued, "He lives in the same house he bought in the early 1960s, and he is one of the world's richest men. Did you ever take the trouble to find out what Jeff and his family were worth, or did you just dismiss them because they lived in the country and had small older homes?" Amy's heart sank even farther when she realized Howard was right. She had assumed that since Jeffrey came from the country and his family lived in the country that they were poor. When she found out about the store, she assumed they were just big ducks in a little puddle and were making a good living for the small town of Steelville. Now she was beginning to realize what she had so cavalierly thrown away in search of sexual excitement and the hopes of making enough money and contacts to rub shoulders with the movers and shakers of the world. If she had kept herself only for Jeffrey and played her cards right, she already had that and would have kept it. Oh my God, why had she insisted on that damn prenuptial agreement? Amy began crying and turned to leave Howard's office. When she reached for the door, Howard said, "Before you leave, send in my new administrative assistant." Amy walked out the door and closed it behind her. Sally rushed to her and wrapped her arm around Amy. She asked, "What's wrong, Amy?" Amy looked at her and said, "Jeffrey and his family are causing trouble for Howard. He fired me this morning. I had no idea Jeff was so rich. Howard asked me to send in his new administrative assistant just before I left the office, Sally. Honey, I know how exciting this life and the travel is, but if you want to keep your husband, you had better quit and get as far away from Howard as you can. I don't know all that's going on, but if Jeff and his family are causing trouble, you could get splattered too. I just hope it's not too late for you." Amy was miserable all the rest of the day. All she could do was sit in her home and cry, wondering how things could have gone so wrong. All she had ever wanted, all she had worked for, was an exciting life in the glamour and glitz of the big city. She had grown up in a small town in Indiana and had sworn she would never let herself get trapped in one again. Her whole life was a battle to get more money and to meet rich, important people so she could rise above the boredom and drudgery of small towns. She had finally had it all within her grasp when Jeff and his family had thrown a monkey wrench into the mix. Amy was seething while she thought about Jeff. How dare he thwart her attempts to get to the top of the heap? She knew now she had made a serious error when she married him, but at the time he had seemed like a rising star. He was a teaching assistant at Wharton School of Business, for God's sake. He graduated magna cum laude. He could have had his choice of jobs and could have lived in any large city in the world, or at least made enough for them to travel there on vacation. How was she to know about the flaw in his character that demanded the simpler life? Amy was wallowing in self-pity when her phone rang. She let the call go to the machine and then picked it up when she recognized her mother's voice. Amy rushed to pick up then when she heard the screeching tirade was sorry she had. "Amy, how could you?" her mother said. "You had the perfect man, and you turned into a little hooker screwing yourself out until he caught you and dumped your sorry bum. My God. You know your father and I aren't prudes. You know we watch porn because I remember catching you and your brothers watching one of our movies when you were younger. I must say, though, that never in my life have I seen some of the things I saw you do on this DVD. Your father and I knew you were oversexed from some of the rumors that got back to us while you were in college. I have to say, though, we would have never in our lives believed you could do something like this. How could you do that to such a wonderful husband?" Amy was still trying to say something when she heard her mother hang up. She dropped the phone and broke into more tears. The rest of the evening her phone rang repeatedly, but she did not answer. Of the calls that went to the machine and had a message recorded, all but one were from friends and family that had received a copy of the DVD in the mail. The one that wasn't was from one of the men she had entertained. He was furious and said, "You damn little witch. I've lost my job and my wife is divorcing me because of you and your boss. If I ever see you again, I have a notion to knock your teeth out. You tell that a-hole you work for that I'm coming for him." The next few weeks drug on for Amy. She had no job to go to, and even with unemployment, her expenses were using up her stash of cash way too rapidly. She cut all the expenses she could. She had thousands of dollars on her credit cards and began making only the minimum payments. She stopped the cable and all her club memberships, but still she hemorrhaged cash. She had sent out over 200 resumes and had even had 3 job interviews, but still had no new job. What was worse, the salary for the job she had interviewed for had only been about half what she was making. One job interview she had scheduled was canceled when the personnel manager found out she had been the woman their purchasing manager had been fired for screwing. He wasn't even polite when he told her he was canceling the interview. In fact, he had said, "Miss Fielding, this company doesn't do business the way you seem to. We want nothing to do with someone who feels like it is good business to screw their way to the top or to screw for contracts. We had to fire a very good friend of mine because of you and your boss's business practices. We don't want anyone in this company who does business that way." Of course, Amy was devastated and cried the rest of the day, but what could she do about it? Finally, the day of her divorce hearing arrived. Amy didn't even want to attend, but her attorney convinced her it was a good idea. Once during the procedure, Amy caught herself staring at Jeff. He was so handsome sitting there with his attorney. Somehow he looked more powerful and commanding than he had while they were still living together. She wondered why she hadn't seen that before. No matter what her attorney tried, they could not break the prenuptial agreement. The judge glared at her when Jeffrey's attorney presented her letter to their firm stating she would not marry Jeffrey unless he would agree to write and sign the prenuptial agreement as she had dictated it. Who in the world would have thought they would keep something like that? She finally leaned to her attorney and instructed him to stop fighting and tell the judge she would agree to the divorce and settlement as Jeffrey had outlined. By that time, all she wanted was for it to be over. She finally realized she was the little birdie that had shit in its own nest and had to live with it. Since the house was no longer hers, Amy spent the rest of the week packing and looking for a place to live. She was thankful she had managed to hide the bonus money Howard had given her. She had accumulated over $200,000 before she got fired, and it was going fast. If she was careful, she could live on it for a little over 3 years before it was all gone. If she could figure out a way to invest it and draw some interest, it would last longer, but she was afraid to do that right now. What if the IRS found out she hadn't reported it? Amy was still hurt that her parents wouldn't let her move back home with them. Even living in her hick hometown would be better than losing all her money. Her father had gone so far when she pleaded with them to tell her they didn't want anything to do with a hooker. Amy thought she might get to live with her sister in her college apartment, but she hadn't got her to agree to that yet. Her sister was scared her father would stop paying the rent if he found out Amy lived there. On Monday evening, after her divorce was final, Amy was sitting at the table she used for a desk surfing the net. She was on a job search site hoping to find a job she could apply for. She had about decided to quit for the evening when the doorbell rang. She stood and looked out the window to see who was there. Sally was standing, leaning on the front door crying. She looked so dejected. Amy rushed to the door and opened it just as Sally was stepping off the porch. Amy said, "Sally, what's the matter?" Sally stopped and turned to Amy. She said, "Oh, Amy, you were right. I only did one more sales call with Howard, then I told him I was going to quit. I told him I was afraid to keep working like I was what with your husband and his family making trouble. I told him the sex and the extra money weren't worth the chance of losing my marriage. He was angry and told me I couldn't quit on him, that he needed me to help build the business back. Amy, I just didn't go back to work the next day, but it was too late. I was served divorce papers for adultery. I did get to talk to Darren before he left, and he told me it was Jeffrey that clued him in. At least we didn't have a prenuptial agreement like you did, so I will get some of our assets." "Oh, Amy, what am I going to do? I love Darren so much. I'm sorry I let you talk me into doing what we did, but you made it seem so exciting and the money would have helped so much. I did have some really wonderful orgasms, but I always felt so guilty doing those things. I am really glad it's over, but now I've lost Darren." "Oh, how could I have been so stupid?" Amy invited Sally in to spend the night. After they had eaten supper, Amy called Janet and invited her over to visit. The three women were drinking wine and talking about their problems. They did manage to solve one of the problems. They all three had some of the money Howard had given them as a bonus squirreled away. Janet had managed to keep the house and some of their assets when she and her husband divorced. She agreed to let the other two women live with her and split the expenses. She had given her mixed-race child up for adoption, so it would only be the three of them. Janet made it clear, though, that she expected them to split all the expenses equally, including the house payment, but she would retain ownership of the house. Their contribution for the house was to be considered rent. Janet was the only one of the women who worked. She had left Harriman Printing and managed to get a poorly paid job elsewhere before all the rumors started flying. Her boss had asked her about Howard and her work for him. She had said she had gotten divorced because of an indiscretion and left the company. She had no knowledge of anything going on there after she had left. He looked at her with a frown, then said, "Well, you've done a good job for me here. Just don't do anything that would get this company in trouble and we will be okay." The three women stayed in touch with some of their friends that still worked for Howard. According to them, Howard was about to go under. His wife had divorced him and taken almost all their investments and the house as her half of the community property. As Jim and Jeff worked through the companies that had employees who had screwed Amy, they exacted a toll. Almost all of the men lost their jobs and the companies pulled business from Howard. The wives had mostly divorced their husbands and taken them to the cleaners. Several times Howard had thought he had a new contract only to have it fall through when it came time to sign. Of the company's representatives that would answer when asked, 8 of 10 told him they didn't want to thwart Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. Howard had become unreasonable in his hatred for that company and all of the Fieldings. He blamed the Fieldings for his reverses and developed a hatred for them that was awesome in its intensity. Howard had laid off 3/4 of his staff. He now only had a dozen printers, 4 salesmen, and 2 secretaries working. He wasn't printing enough to pay the bills some months. He had sold his country club membership and was cutting all his personal expenses, just as had Amy and her friends. One Monday morning, just before lunch, Howard took the call that sounded his company's death knell. His banker called and told him he had a week to get caught up on his loan payments or they would start proceedings to force him into involuntary bankruptcy. He said he was calling to give him a heads up because they had once been friends and he had been a good customer for the bank. They were mailing the official notice that afternoon. Howard did not even take a lunch break that day. He immediately started trying to find other financing, but he couldn't. Between the decline in his sales and the rumors that were abounding, most bankers wouldn't even talk to him. Of those who did talk to him, none would send him paperwork to apply for a loan when they found out the trouble his company was in. By the end of that week, Howard was a totally broken man. Monday morning of the week after he talked with his banker, he received an attorney in his office. He was told the bank was filing the foreclosure papers that day, and they were planning on placing him in involuntary bankruptcy. Howard just sat and stared at the attorney until he finished talking and left his office. He placed his head in his hands and seethed. He still couldn't believe that little pissant was so damn upset over his wife that he would do this. He was even more disbelieving about the ability of someone to so totally and rapidly ruin him. Always before, when he made a threat or a request, people jumped to do his bidding. Hell, a lot of the women's husbands had even known about their women screwing whoever he told them to and let it go because of his threats to ruin them. Howard opened his top middle desk drawer. He looked inside the drawer, then reached out for the pistol resting there. It would be so easy. No, Before it came to that, he had to take care of that damn Jeffy and his family. Howard left his office and locked it and the building behind him. His business continued to decline. Then one afternoon, he got a call from a business broker. They got right to the point. They were in contact with a business that had heard his business was in trouble. That business might be interested in purchasing his printing business if the price was right. Would he be interested in selling? At first, Howard was going to refuse, but then he decided to see what the offer was. He was pleasantly surprised at its generosity. Without taking the time to crunch the numbers, it looked like they would pay off all his loans, and he would still have about $250,000 in cash if he sold to them. They made it plain that the deal was contingent on him signing the contract immediately and on him agreeing to never compete in the printing business again in his life. Howard told them to send the contract, and he would review it, then let them know. Howard was so happy he treated himself to a nice meal, one like he used to have all the time when he was wining and dining his customers and suppliers with his administrative assistants. Of course, then it hadn't mattered if the meal cost $200 or more per person. Many times the supplier's representatives had paid, and if they hadn't, Howard charged it off as a business expense. The contract came by overnight registered mail the next day. Howard made another serious mistake. The contract looked so simple, and he believed the man on the phone, so he didn't have an attorney review it. His law firm was one of his web of suppliers that had refused to do further business with him after his problems began. They told him they didn't need business like his and to find another firm. He hadn't done that and didn't want to take the time now because his buyer had given him such a short deadline. Howard read the contract and chuckled as he signed it. Hell, he could take the money that was left when his bills were paid and start over somewhere else in another business. If he could find the right assistant, he would be on top of the heap again in no time. He should have read the fine print closer, especially the print that said they guaranteed to satisfy his debts up to the balance of the agreed-upon purchase price of the business, with any remainder coming to him in a certified check. The day of closing came, and it dawned bright and sunny. Howard felt that must be an omen. The closing of the deal was to be in the main office of the bank Howard used. Before they would sign a lien release and withdraw the involuntary bankruptcy filing, they had to receive their share of the purchase price to satisfy Howard's loans. The bank would then sign a lien release before he got his check for the rest of the sales amount. Howard was bubbling with happiness when he walked into the bank. Things were finally looking up for him once again. He was beginning his recovery from the hell those Fieldings had put him through. Now all he had to do was find another business to operate and begin his payback to the Fieldings after he collected his check, of course. Howard was escorted into the meeting room in time to see the back door to the room close. There were 5 men in the room at the table. One was his banker. One was an officer of the court, one the bank's attorney. The other 2 were from the purchasing company, one an attorney, and the other was the chairman of the board. Howard felt like he knew the attorney but couldn't remember from where. Everything was very businesslike. Howard signed "we're told" and smiled. The banker and attorneys reviewed the papers. His banker pointed out that the vice president of operations, acquisitions, and research for Steelville Feed and Farm Supply hadn't signed one page of the documents. Howard became upset and demanded, "What do you mean by that? What does that damn pissant store have to do with this deal?" The banker looked at Howard and said, "What do you mean by that? They're the ones that bought your business, Howard." "Oh no, they didn't. I agreed to sell to Western Missouri Printing." "What's going on here?" The attorney that looked familiar smiled when he said, "I'm sorry for the confusion. You did sell to Western Missouri Printing, but they are a wholly owned subsidiary of Steelville Feed and Farm Supply, so Mr. Jeffrey Fielding, the vice president of operations, acquisitions, and research has to sign off on the purchase in addition to the signatures from our printing division. Don't worry, he just stepped out for a moment. I'll call him back in. He can sign, and then we can finish this deal." While Steve was calling Jeff back into the room, Howard said, "Bullshit. The deal is off. I'm not letting that little pissant take my business from me." He reached for the documents, but the banker's attorney picked them up first. "Howard, I'm sorry, but you have already signed these documents. That makes them a valid contract unless the purchaser decides not to sign also. The only way this deal can be stopped is by mutual agreement or failure of a party involved to sign." Just as Howard was starting to respond, Jeffrey walked into the room. "I'm sorry, I wasn't here for the signing. I had to make a restroom stop, then I got a phone call. Here, just let me sign, and we can finish this business." After the final signature, the attorneys looked over the files once more, then distributed the copies to the parties involved with the deal. The checks that had already been prepared were given to the banker for Harriman Printing, and everyone began putting their documents into their briefcases. After the bank had their check and they had given the officer of the court the paperwork withdrawing the involuntary bankruptcy petition, Howard sat waiting. He was so angry he could barely keep quiet, but he didn't want to do anything until he had his funds. He watched in shock as the other men continued gathering up their papers and putting them in their briefcases. Finally, Howard said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but aren't you forgetting something?" The chairman of Western Missouri Printing looked around the room and said, "No, I don't think we are. Do you know of anything we left out, Steve? Or do you, Mr. Fielding?" The attorney shook his head no and kept unloading his briefcase. Howard was getting angry by this time and shouted, "You haven't paid me yet. I was supposed to get about $250,000 in addition to having the loans paid off if my calculations are correct." "Oh," the chairman said. "I completely forgot the paperwork on that amount. Let me see here. Oh, yes, here it is. The balance left over was $247,563.79. Howard began smiling again when the chairman said that. His smile died, though, when he heard him continue, "Here is the receipt for its disbursement." "I'm so sorry we forgot to give that to you." Howard jumped to his feet in anger. He shouted, "Disbursement? What the hell do you mean, disbursement? That money was supposed to come to me." Now the attorney said, "Oh, I'm sorry for the mix-up. You were right, that was your money, but you must have forgotten the lien against your assets should you ever sell the business. You remember your divorce decree required you to pay your ex-wife a percentage of the gross sale price of the business if you sold it in her lifetime? I'm sorry to tell you that after expenses what you had left didn't quite cover that amount. I'm sure you'll be hearing from her and her attorney to make arrangements for payment of the balance." Just as Howard was walking toward the door, Jeff came into the room again. Howard stopped and stared at him. His face got red and he started shaking. "You little pissant. What are you doing here again?" Jeff smiled and said, "Oh, good. You're still here, Howie. I forgot to tell you that I have some men here that will escort you back to your old office so you can pick up your personal belongings. Sorry for the oversight." Howard stood there in shock. He was so angry he was shaking, and he was thinking, how could this little pissant be the vice president of operations, acquisitions, and research of the company that had just finished putting him in the poorhouse? He stared at Jeff once again and muttered, "You son of a witch," while he stalked out the door. Howard was met in the corridor by a uniformed guard. His uniform shoulder patch said 4 State Security Service, a division of Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. The guard said, "Mr. Harriman?" When Howard shook his head yes, the guard continued, "I am supposed to escort you to your former office so you can gather any personal items you have remaining there before you leave the building. Shall we go?" Howard looked at the guard and slumped in defeat. He only nodded his head and began walking. The guard followed. When they got to the garage, the guard got into Howard's car with him. He said, "I'll just ride with you so we can get you back into the building. My people will follow in our van." When Howard walked into his building, he saw another uniformed guard standing by the door. His receptionist wouldn't even look at him as he was escorted to his former office. He walked through the door and stopped dead in his tracks. Jeffrey Fielding was sitting in a guest chair talking to a well-dressed woman seated behind his desk. Howard felt his face redden and he grated out, "You a-hole. What the hell are you doing in my office? Now get out." Jeffrey looked at Howard and said, "First of all, Howie, this is no longer your office. Secondly, I own this company now, and I will sit anywhere I want to. Thirdly, I was discussing continuing operations with the president of our printing division, Mrs. Hartshorn, while we wait on the new plant manager. Not that it is any of your business." Jeff turned to Mrs. Hartshorn and said, "Perhaps we should take a break while Mr. Harriman cleans out this office. We've about covered everything we need to talk about today anyway." A few days later, Howard was sitting on his patio cleaning his pistol when one of his very few remaining friends walked up. He watched Howard a moment, then said, "Howard, I have heard you were spending a lot of time at the range. In fact, I watched you this morning. Hitting the target 7 out of 10 times is pretty good, but not good enough. Howard, if you're getting ready to do what I think you're considering, you need to change your mind." Howard looked at his friend and said, "I don't know what you mean, Jack. I just don't have much of anything to do now that my company is gone, so I took up target shooting." "Is that a crime?" Jack said, "Well, no, it's not if that is all you're doing. In case you were thinking of revenge, though, I think you should know something about the Fieldings. Jim Fielding is a retired Lieutenant Colonel Army Ranger. Paul Fielding is a retired Green Beret Colonel. Jeffrey Fielding was a Green Beret Captain before he got out of the Army. He is still in the reserves. Almost every male in the Fielding family is prior service, and many of their employees are retired or prior service members. Even if you get lucky and get 1 or 2 of them, they will get you. I think you really should let sleeping dogs lie and go somewhere else to start over." Howard sat in shock as what his friend said sank in. He sighed and said, "Yeah, sounds like." The next day, Howard packed what little he had left and headed for the Pacific Northwest. He arrived in Portland, Oregon with all his possessions in his car and a burning hatred in his belly for a family named Fielding. He was sitting in a cheap hotel bar reading through the want ads when another guest sat beside him. The dowdy-looking man looked at the job offers Howard had circled in the help wanted section of the paper and said, "Things are tough, huh? I've been looking for work for 3 weeks myself. What's your story anyway? Housing bubble get you, or was it the banking meltdown?" Howard was feeling talkative that afternoon, so he told a modified version of his story. He ended by saying, "In short, I had everything I had ever wanted. I had a wife to take care of the house, a business that made me a ton of money, and every 2 years I found another stupid woman to screw and party with. My customers loved the sex and got a kick out of getting to screw married women and hang the horns on their husbands. I just screwed up. I screwed the wrong 304, and her ex-husband and his family screwed me. They had more clout and I couldn't beat them. My wife divorced me and took nearly everything I had but the business. Then those damn Fieldings managed to take my business and merge it into theirs. The damn attorneys tell me there's nothing I can do about it because it was all done legally. Now here I am with nothing, trying to start over at age 56. His new friend looked at him and shook his head. He said, "Tough. Yes, we're both sort of in the same boat. My wife caught me tapping some on the side and cleaned me out too. Well, guess I'll catch you later." After the divorce, Jeffrey returned to Steelville and resumed his work. The only bright spots in his life right now were Abigail and his successful retribution against Howard. He had won, but for some reason it felt like he lost in doing so. He really wasn't sorry to leave Springville, but even after all she had done, he missed Amy terribly. No, that wasn't right. He missed what he thought he and Amy had. He had no intention of ever getting back with her, but he missed the companionship and loving he thought they had before she took a wrong turn. Jeff was sitting at his desk when Abigail walked into the room. She looked at his dejected posture and the lost look in his eyes and felt her heart swell with compassion for him. She didn't know what was wrong with either of them. She had never let herself get this close to anyone before and didn't understand why she had done so this time. Abby also didn't understand why Jeff didn't just snap out of it. It had been a year now since his problems had started. He was divorced, he had broken the man that caused the divorce, and his accomplices then bought and added an excellent company to their conglomerate. From what she heard, the Harriman Printing Division of Western Missouri Printing was already adding greatly to the company's bottom line. They had even hired back all the employees Mr. Harriman had laid off, with the exception of his assistants, of course. Abby knew she wasn't supposed to know about Steelville Feed and Farm Supply's portfolio, but she cleaned and cooked for Jeff, and sometimes he left his computer on or documents lying opened on his desk while she cleaned. She had seen several documents that surprised her. She had no idea she worked for such a large company until she began taking care of Jeff. As far as she knew, no one in Steelville knew how well off the Fieldings were either. Without thinking, Abby walked up and put her hands on Jeffrey's shoulders. She leaned down slightly and said, "Jeff, you've been staring at that screen for 5 minutes now. It's after 6 p.m. Why don't you just quit? We could get a nice swim in if you hurry. After that, I can make you supper if you want." Jeff turned to Abby and smiled. He said, "That's the best idea I've had all afternoon. I can't seem to concentrate anyway, so let's go." Abby giggled and pulled her shirt over her head, then pushed her shorts down. She was now standing in front of Jeff in a beautiful red bikini. "I'm ready. What's taking you so long?" she asked. Abby giggled and ran from the room when Jeff yelled and reached for her. "Last one in has to clean the kitchen after supper," she said as she ran for the swimming hole. Jeff dived in the water, and it struck to his mind, life may not be all happiness for me, but it still offered hope, and her name was Abigail. What happened to Amy, you ask? She left for a big town in the north and is now working as an office assistant. As for Howard, after trying for months to find a job, he finally used his pistol. He was found with a single piece of lead in his head. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.